Every year, families gather around the table, sharing laughter, stories, and a meal that feels timeless. Thanksgiving has become a day for gratitude, for warmth, for remembering what we're thankful for. But behind the comfort of turkey and pie lies a history that's far more complex than the picture books ever showed us. First Thanksgiving wasn't just about food or friendship. It was about survival, diplomacy, and two worlds colliding in an uncertain new land. You think you know the story of Thanksgiving, but most of what we've been taught is full of myths. These are 10 surprising truths behind Thanksgiving. When we think of the first Thanksgiving, most of us imagine this giant, harmonious feast. Hundreds of pilgrims and Native Americans sitting together at long tables, sharing turkey, corn, and laughter, like one big, happy family. That's the story we grew up with in textbooks and holiday specials. The truth is a lot smaller and a lot more interesting. Only about 50 pilgrims attended, survivors of brutal winter that had killed many of its colony. About 90 Wampanoag men came, led by Maswat, bringing food and gifts, but they weren't just being friendly. There was a strategy in their visit. The Wampanoag wanted to ensure these newcomers wouldn't threaten them, and the pilgrims needed guidance to survive in the unfamiliar land. So instead of a massive festival, it was a small, cautious meeting, a gathering of necessity, diplomacy, and survival. And that in its own way is far more fascinating than the story we usually hear. Most of us like to think the first Thanksgiving was all about gratitude. Pilgrims and Native Americans gathering to give thanks for a bountiful harvest, enjoying a peaceful day of sharing and celebration. It's the story we've been told for generations, a simple, heartfelt expression of thanks. But the truth is, it was much more strategic than that. The feast served as a political and survival tool. The pilgrims were still new to the land, relying on the Wampanoag for guidance on farming, fishing, and hunting. For the Wampanoag, the gathering was a way of solidarity and alliance, display strength, and manage relations with a foreign group in their territory. So what looks like a simple celebration of gratitude was actually a carefully negotiated meeting, a way for two very different groups to communicate, cooperate, and ensure survival. In other words, the first Thanksgiving was as much about politics as it was about thanks. When we imagine the first Thanksgiving, we almost automatically picture a table piled high with roasted turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, and slices of pumpkin pie. That's the classic holiday image, what we see in movies, magazines, and even family dinners today. In reality, the menu was very different. The pilgrims didn't have ovens or sugar for desserts, so pumpkin pie as we know it didn't exist. Instead, they likely enjoyed venison, wild fowl like ducks or geese, seafood such as clams, mussels, and eels, and vegetables that were in season, including beans, corn, and squash. These were foods that they could hunt, gather, and grow locally, and the Wampanoag contributed much of it. So instead of the rich, sweet, and familiar dishes we think of today, the first Thanksgiving feast was as practical and resourceful celebration, reflecting survival, cooperation, and the harvest of the land around them. We've all been taught that the first Thanksgiving was placed in late November, around the same time we celebrate today. It's easy to picture the crisp fall air, colorful leaves, and the approach of winter all fitting neatly with our modern holiday calendar. But the truth is, no one really knows the exact date. Historical accounts suggest the feast likely happened sometime between September and November, after the pilgrims finished harvesting their crops. They were more concerned with survival than tradition, gathering food, preparing shelters, and establishing relationships with the Wampanoag. The idea of celebrating on the fourth Thursday of November didn't exist until Abraham Lincoln declared it a national holiday in 1863, over 2 centuries later. So while we like to think of crisp November Day, the first Thanksgiving was really an early fall harvest celebration, practical, adaptive, and driven by the rhythms of the land rather than the fixed calendar dates. It's easy to assume that Thanksgiving has always been a fixed national holiday, celebrated with the same consistency we see today, with parades, family dinners, and football games. After all, it feels like it's always been part of American life. But the truth is, for nearly 2 centuries, Thanksgiving was celebrated only locally and inconsistently. Different colonies and states observed days of thanks at varying times, and there was no uniform tradition. It wasn't until Sarah Joseph Hale, a writer and editor, campaigned tirelessly for decades that the idea of a national Thanksgiving gained traction. Finally, in 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln declared it a federal holiday, partly to unify the divided nation. So what we take for granted as a long-standing tradition is actually the result of years of advocacy, historical circumstances, and a desire for national unity. Many people imagine the Wampanoag simply sitting politely at the first Thanksgiving, smiling and enjoying the Pilgrims' hospitality. The story we often hear makes it seem as though they were passive observers, quietly participating in someone else's celebration. The truth is quite the opposite. The Wampanoag were essential to the Pilgrims' survival. They taught the newcomers how to plant corn, fish in local rivers, and hunt wild game. Their knowledge of the land, crops, and seasons was critical. Without it, the Pilgrims likely wouldn't have made it through the first harsh winter. The feast wasn't just a gesture of goodwill. It reflected the Wampanoag's active role in guiding, teaching, and supporting the colony. They weren't passive guests at all. They were partners in survival, and their contributions shaped the very foundation of what we now call Thanksgiving. Most of the people think of Thanksgiving as a single day, a one-time meal with family and friends, ending with leftovers and pumpkin pie. That's how we celebrate it today, so it's natural to assume the first Thanksgiving was the same. In reality, the 1621 feast lasted 3 full days. It wasn't just about eating. There were games, hunting expeditions, and religious observance woven into the celebration. This extended gathering allowed both the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag to interact more deeply, negotiate alliances, and build trust. Multi-day harvest celebrations were common in both European and native traditions, so a single-day meal would have seemed unusual to the participants. The first Thanksgiving then was a dynamic multi-day event, a mixture of sustenance, ceremony, and social connections, far richer and more complex than our modern one-day holiday. It's tempting to imagine the first Thanksgiving as a scene of perfect harmony. Pilgrims and Native Americans smiling, laughing, and sharing food without a care in the world. That's the version most of us grew up hearing. The reality was far more complicated. Relations between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag were a delicate balance of trust, negotiation, and cultural differences. Language barriers and different customs meant misunderstandings were common, and every interaction carried a layer of political significance. Cooperation was a necessity for survival, but it wasn't effortless. The Wampanoag were careful to assert their authority, while the Pilgrims were cautious newcomers. So while the first Thanksgiving was a step toward friendship and alliance, it was also full of tension, diplomacy, and careful negotiation, far from the simple picture of everyone getting along perfectly. When we think of Thanksgiving today, we picture big parades marching down city streets, football games on TV, and families gathering around a turkey-centric meal. It's easy to assume these traditions have always been part of the holiday, handed down from the very first feast. In truth, almost all of these traditions are modern inventions. Parades didn't begin until the early 20th century, with the famous Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade starting in 1924. Football games became popular even later, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The iconic turkey dinner itself only became widespread in the mid-19th century, largely due to marketing, literature, and changing agriculture practices. So what we think as a classic Thanksgiving imagery is actually a product of centuries of evolution. The holiday we know today is very different from the small, practical, and politically significant feast shared in 1621, showing how traditions grow, adapt, and take on a new meaning over time. Many people assume that the Wampanoag and other native communities were untouched by European illnesses before the first Thanksgiving. The idea of a harmonious gathering suggests both groups were wealthy and thriving, meeting on equal footing. In reality, European diseases like the smallpox, influenza, and measles had already swept through many native communities by 1621, decimating populations and reshaping societies. The Wampanoag had suffered significant losses, which influenced their diplomacy and interactions with the Pilgrims. Their participation in the feast was not just an act of friendship, it was a part of a careful strategy to protect and rebuild their community while navigating a rapidly changing world. Understanding this context highlights how survival, strategy, and resilience defined the first Thanksgiving for more than simple goodwill. Thanksgiving is more than just turkey and pie, more than parades, football, or even perfectly set tables. At its heart, it's a story of survival, diplomacy, and meeting cultures. It's about people learning to cooperate in a world full of uncertainty, in the fragile alliances that made life possible in a new land. By looking past the myths and exploring the real stories, the careful gatherings, shared knowledge, struggles, and negotiations, we gain a deeper understanding of what this holiday really represents. Gratitude, yes, but also resilience, connection, and the ways human beings come together to survive, celebrate, and build a community. So the next time you sit down at your Thanksgiving table, remember that the first feast was far more complex, far more human, and far more fascinating than most of us have ever been told. And if you enjoyed uncovering these truths, be sure to subscribe for more stories, history, and surprising facts you won't find in the textbooks.